The Seraphim drifted silently through the vastness of space, its engines humming softly as it passed the glowing remains of a distant star. On board, the crew was busy with their daily tasks, preparing for their next mission. But in the galley, a new face stood quietly, stirring a pot of stew. Her name was Arya. Arya didn't speak much, in fact, she rarely spoke at all. When Captain Jackson had hired her, he'd been unsure about the silent woman. She had no remarkable background, no flashy credentials, and her only talent, as far as anyone could tell, was cooking. At first, the crew had wondered why Jackson hired her. The Seraphim was a ship full of skilled mercenaries, engineers, and scientists. They were used to working with tough, talkative people who could hold their own in any situation. But Arya wasn't like that. She stayed in the galley, cooking meals without complaint, always with a quiet smile on her face, never asking for much. The crew was skeptical. They thought of her as just another quiet person with no real use. It wasn't that they disliked her, but the silence made them uncomfortable. Everyone was used to banter and loud voices. Arya's quiet presence was different. Then came the first meal she prepared for the crew, a simple vegetable stew. The galley was filled with the rich scent of the stew as it bubbled away on the stove. The crew gathered around the table, curious, but unsure. They had no idea what to expect. When the first spoonful hit their tongues, they froze. The stew was nothing like they had imagined. It was rich, flavorful, and perfectly spiced. The crew members exchanged surprised glances. How could something so simple taste so good? Arya stood silently at the counter, her eyes focused on the stove. She didn't ask for praise. She simply continued her work. As the days went by, the crew began to look forward to meal times. They started to notice little things about Arya. How she moved with grace. How she could whip up an entire meal without breaking a sweat. How everything she made tasted better than the last. She never asked for attention, never bragged, but her food spoke for her. It told them she was more than just a cook. Captain Jackson, though, had his doubts. He hadn't had time to get to know Arya. He was too busy leading the crew, managing their missions, and keeping them alive. But every time he sat down to one of her meals, he couldn't help but feel a strange respect for the quiet woman. One day, after a particularly long mission, the crew gathered in the mess hall. The lights were dim, and a sense of exhaustion hung in the air. Everyone was tired, their faces grim from the battle they had just survived. They needed comfort. They needed something familiar. As always, Arya was waiting in the galley. She didn't say a word. She simply placed a steaming dish of roasted chicken and vegetables in the center of the table. The crew, weary and drained, hesitated for a moment. But then they picked up their utensils and dug in. The taste was unlike anything they had ever experienced, a combination of flavors that brought warmth to their hearts and energy to their tired bodies. "Damn, Arya," said one of the crew members, wiping his mouth. "This is the best thing I've had in weeks." The rest of the crew nodded in agreement, their faces lighting up with appreciation. Jackson watched them, his eyes lingering on Arya as she quietly cleaned up the counter. She didn't respond to the praise, and she didn't seem to care for the attention. Jackson wasn't sure what to make of her. On one hand, she was an excellent cook and the crew was happy to have her. But on the other hand, there was something unsettling about how little he knew about her. She had no history, no past that she spoke of. And despite the fact that she seemed to be liked by the crew, she remained distant, always keeping to herself. But Jackson had learned a long time ago that not everything needed to be understood. Sometimes people didn't need to talk to be valuable. Maybe Arya didn't need to speak to show her worth. Maybe her actions, the way she quietly took care of the crew, were enough. That night after the meal, Jackson found himself walking toward the galley. He stopped just outside the door, watching Arya as she wiped down the counters, lost in her own world. He thought about the way she had quietly earned the crew's respect, the way they had started looking to her for comfort in the most difficult moments, and the way her cooking had become a kind of quiet therapy for everyone aboard the Seraphim. "You're doing a good job," Jackson said, his voice low. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe it was just because he needed to acknowledge it even if she didn't need the praise. Arya looked up at him, her face expressionless, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. A glimmer of appreciation, perhaps. She nodded once, and for the first time, Jackson thought he saw a small smile tug at the corner of her lips. "I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson blinked, surprised by her words. It was the most she had said to him since she arrived, but instead of feeling uncomfortable, he felt something else, something he couldn't quite explain. "Well," Jackson said, stepping closer, "you're hired." The words were simple, but they felt like a promise. He didn't know it then, but that simple statement would change everything. Arya had already become more than just a cook to him and the rest of the crew. She was a part of the Seraphim, and though she spoke little, her presence had already made a lasting impact. As Jackson left the galley, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Arya than anyone knew. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly the way she wanted it. The Seraphim was drifting through the outer reaches of a distant galaxy. The crew had just completed a mission to secure a supply of vital minerals from an asteroid field. But the journey back was never as simple as it seemed. Every now and then, the crew found themselves in unexpected situations, and today was no different. It started with a strange signal coming from a nearby planet. It was a distress call. At first, Captain Jackson thought it was another of the usual pirate traps, a way to lure unsuspecting ships into an ambush. But something about the signal felt different, genuine even. "We're going to check it out," Jackson ordered, his voice steady and clear. "Prepare for a landing. Arya, you're with us." Arya was in the galley as usual, preparing the crew's meals for the next few hours. Her quiet focus on her work was almost calming, like the steady hum of the ship's engines. But when she heard the captain's order, she simply nodded and followed him without saying a word. The crew gathered in the transport bay, gearing up for the planet's surface. It wasn't the first time they'd been sent to investigate a potential threat, but the strange signal had everyone on edge. The atmosphere on the ship was tense as they prepared for the worst. As the transport shuttle descended toward the planet, Jackson's crew scanned the landscape below. The terrain was rugged, with jagged mountains and sparse vegetation. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would choose to live, but it seemed quiet enough. The shuttle touched down with a soft thud, and the crew disembarked, weapons ready. The planet's surface was barren, but there were signs of activity. Footprints in the dirt, broken equipment scattered across the ground. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the distance. A figure emerged from the shadows, her face covered by a mask. She was tall, slender, and appeared to be carrying something heavy. Her posture was tense, and it was clear that she was afraid. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice shaky. The crew froze, unsure of what to do. This was the person who had sent the distress signal. But something felt off. There was fear in her eyes, but also a certain strength, like she had been through something terrible. "We're here to help," Jackson said, his voice calm. "Lower your weapon. We're not here to hurt you." But the woman didn't lower her weapon. Instead, she took a defensive stance and tightened her grip. "You don't understand. They're coming. They'll find me. They always do." Arya stepped forward, quietly assessing the situation. Jackson noticed her usual calm presence cutting through the tension like a knife. She didn't say a word, but the way she moved spoke volumes. Without a single command, she drew a small pistol from her side and aimed it at the woman's weapon. "Drop it." Arya's voice was quiet, but firm. It was the first time she had spoken since the mission began. The woman hesitated. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, a group of alien attackers emerged from the rocks around them. They were quick and deadly, their bladed weapons gleaming in the dim light of the planet's sun. The crew sprang into action, but it was Arya who moved the fastest. She was already in motion before anyone else had time to react. Without hesitation, she took down one of the attackers with a precise shot to the shoulder, causing him to collapse. Jackson watched, surprised. He had no idea Arya was such a skilled fighter. She was usually in the background making meals, staying quiet. But now she was a force of nature, calm, collected, and deadly. The crew quickly followed her lead, but the attackers were relentless. For every one they took down, 2 more seemed to appear from the rocks. The battle raged on and the crew was starting to feel the pressure. Arya, however, was everywhere at once. She moved with the precision of a trained soldier, dodging attacks, and taking out enemies with swift, decisive strikes. The crew was following her lead now, working together with newfound respect for the silent woman who had saved them. At one point, Arya ducked behind a boulder to reload her weapon, but the attack was relentless. One of the attackers managed to slip past the crew and got dangerously close to the injured woman who had sent the distress signal. She was on the ground, struggling to move, her weapon forgotten in the chaos. Without thinking, Arya sprinted toward her. Her eyes locked on the enemy. She jumped forward, knocking the attacker off balance. In a fluid motion, she disarmed him, her knife flashing in the sunlight as she took him down. The crew watched in awe as she moved, her quiet strength a sharp contrast to the violence of the battle. The last of the attackers fell, their weapons scattered across the ground. The crew took a moment to catch their breath, their bodies bruised and bloodied, but alive. Jackson looked at Arya, his expression a mix of admiration and confusion. He had never seen anyone fight like that before. There was a coldness to her actions, but it was efficient, flawless even. "You saved us," one of the crew members said, his voice full of gratitude. "We would have been done for without you." Arya said nothing, only nodded, her eyes scanning the area for any more threats. She didn't need words. Her actions spoke louder than anything she could have said. Jackson finally spoke, his voice quiet. "What are you, Arya? You're not just a cook, are you?" She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, with a simple shake of her head, she replied, "I'm just someone who does what's needed." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Jackson realized then that Arya had never been just the cook. She had always been more than that, someone who could protect the crew just as easily as she could nourish them. As they made their way back to the shuttle, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the quiet woman who had saved their lives. He had underestimated her just like everyone else, but now he knew better. Arya didn't need to say anything to prove her worth. Her actions spoke for her. The Seraphim sailed through the dark stretches of space, its engines humming steadily. The crew had returned to their mission, and life aboard the ship had returned to its usual rhythm. But there was something different now. Arya's presence had changed things. She wasn't just the quiet cook anymore. She had proven herself in ways no one expected. She had saved their lives. Again and again. Jackson couldn't stop thinking about the way Arya had moved during the battle on the planet. It was like she was in her element, calm and composed, while the rest of them were fighting for survival. She didn't flinch when danger came at her. It was almost like she was trained for moments like that, trained to kill. But why would someone who could fight like that choose to stay hidden in the galley, far from the action? It was a question that weighed heavily on Jackson's mind, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized he needed answers. He found her one evening, just after the crew had finished another long day of repairs and maintenance. The mess hall was quiet, and the crew had gone to their quarters for some much-needed rest. But not Arya. She was sitting alone at the table, her eyes focused on something in the distance. "Arya," Jackson called softly as he approached her. She looked up but didn't speak. "Can we talk?" Jackson asked, his voice hesitant. She didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she nodded. He took a seat across from her, and they sat in silence for a moment. The quiet between them felt natural, like something they were both comfortable with. But Jackson knew that silence wasn't always easy. Sometimes it was a mask, hiding things that wanted to stay buried. "You know," Jackson began, trying to find the right words, "I've been thinking about what happened on that planet. You were incredible." He paused. "But I can't help wondering why you didn't tell anyone about those skills before. Why didn't you share that with us?" Arya looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. Some things are better left in the past, she said quietly. Jackson studied her face, trying to understand what she meant. There was something behind her words, something more than just her reluctance to talk. It was like she was carrying a burden, one that weighed her down, even now. He leaned forward, his tone softer now. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I think the crew needs to know. They trust you, Arya, I trust you. For the first time since he had known her, Arya's expression softened just a little. It was brief, but it was there. She sighed and set her cup down. I wasn't always just a cook, she said, her voice low. I was trained to fight, trained to kill. Jackson didn't say anything. He waited for her to continue, knowing that if he pushed her too hard, she might close up again. I was part of a military unit, Arya continued, her voice distant, like she wasn't talking to him anymore. We were supposed to protect my home planet from invaders, but things went wrong. They attacked faster than we could react. We lost everything, my family, my friends, my planet. I was one of the few survivors. Jackson felt a pang of sympathy for her. He had heard stories of planets destroyed by war, but to hear it from someone who had lived through it, it hit harder. He could see now why she had shut herself off from the crew, why she didn't want anyone to know the truth. Why? Didn't you go back? Jackson asked, carefully choosing his words. You could have fought for your people. You could have led them. Arya looked at him then, her eyes colder than he had ever seen them. I couldn't, she said simply. I couldn't lead people who were already dead. There was a long silence between them. Jackson let her words sink in, and when she didn't continue, he knew that was all she wanted to say. He didn't press her any further. You've been running ever since, haven't you? He asked gently. Arya nodded, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. Yes, running, hiding. It's the only thing I've been good at. Jackson was quiet for a moment, then spoke again, his voice filled with conviction. You're not running anymore. You're with us now, and you don't have to hide anymore. Arya's eyes flickered with something, anger, frustration, before her gaze softened. I'm not hiding, she said softly. I'm just not ready to face it all yet. Maybe I never will be. Jackson didn't respond right away. He knew better than to push her. Instead, he sat there watching her as she quietly stared out of the window, her face distant once again. The weight of her past hung in the air like an invisible force, and Jackson understood now why she kept it buried so deep. He stood up slowly, then paused. If you ever need to talk, he said quietly, I'm here. Arya didn't look at him. Thanks, she said, but her voice was hollow. I don't know if I ever will. Jackson didn't push her any further. He knew better than to force someone to open up before they were ready. He could tell Arya was a woman of few words, and even fewer secrets. But those secrets were heavy, and they shaped her in ways that Jackson couldn't fully understand. As he left the mess hall, he couldn't help but feel that he had learned something important. Arya wasn't just the quiet cook or the skilled fighter. She was someone who had lost everything and had no intention of looking back. She had a past that haunted her, but it wasn't something she could ever leave behind. She was carrying it with her every step of the way, and in some ways Jackson realized so was he. The weight of his own past was never far from his mind, but it didn't stop him from moving forward. Arya, however, had yet to find a way to move on. She was still fighting the ghosts of her past, and Jackson wasn't sure if she ever would. But one thing was clear. Whatever the future held, Arya wasn't going to face it alone. She had a crew now, a crew that trusted her, a crew that would follow her into any battle no matter the cost. And for the first time since he'd met her, Jackson felt a sense of certainty about the path ahead. The Seraphim drifted through the cold silence of space, its engines purring steadily as the crew prepared for another mission. The stars outside twinkled in the distance, seemingly indifferent to the lives of those aboard the ship. But inside, things were changing. Arya was quieter than ever. She had returned to her usual routine, cooking meals for the crew and doing her part. But there was something different about her. She seemed more distant, lost in her thoughts. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within her after their last conversation. He wanted to help her, but he wasn't sure how. One evening, just before the crew settled in for the night, Jackson was called to the bridge. The crew had intercepted another distress signal. This time from a rebel base on a distant planet. It was urgent. The signal had been scrambled, but the message was clear. Help was needed. "We need to go there," Jackson said as he scanned the message, his face hardening. "Prepare the crew. We leave immediately." Arya was waiting in the galley when Jackson came through. She didn't look up when he entered. She was chopping vegetables, her movements precise and fluid. For a moment he just stood there watching her. He had grown accustomed to her silence, but tonight, it felt heavier than usual. "You're going with us, right?" Jackson asked, his voice gentle. Arya paused for a moment before responding. "Of course, I'll pack." Jackson hesitated. He wanted to ask her about the things she hadn't said, the things that weighed on her, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. He had learned that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. The shuttle landed with a soft thud on the dusty surface of the rebel base. The crew disembarked, weapons ready, as they made their way toward the hidden compound. The planet was barren, its atmosphere thin and dry. The rebel base was tucked away in a canyon surrounded by jagged rocks that provided natural cover. The crew entered the compound with caution, moving quickly through the maze of narrow passages. They were met by a group of rebels who looked just as weary as the crew. The leader, a tall woman with short-cropped hair and a stern expression, stepped forward. "Captain Jackson," she greeted him with a nod. "We need your help. The invaders are closing in. We can't hold them off much longer." Jackson nodded. "We'll do what we can. Where are they?" The rebel leader pointed toward a nearby canyon. "They've set up camp there. We've been able to slow them down, but they have far more firepower than we expected." Jackson turned to his crew, preparing them for what was ahead. "Let's move out. Stay close. We don't know what we're up against." As they made their way to the canyon, Arya fell into step beside Jackson. For the first time in days, she spoke. "Captain," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something important." Jackson glanced at her, surprised by the urgency in her voice. "What is it?" Arya took a deep breath. "This base, it's not just a rebel outpost. It's where I came from. It's my home." Jackson stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. "What do you mean, your home?" Arya's eyes flickered with something that looked like pain, but she quickly masked it. "I was born here. My family was part of the resistance against the invaders. We fought for our freedom until they came. They destroyed everything. My parents, my people, they're all gone." Jackson stood there for a moment, processing her words. He had known Arya had a past, but he never imagined it was tied to something like this. The woman who had quietly cooked for them, who had fought alongside them without a second thought. She had a history, a legacy that was much darker than he had realized. "I didn't want anyone to know," Arya continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to remember. I thought I could just move on. But I can't. I can't run from it anymore." Jackson watched her closely, his expression softening. "Arya, you don't have to run. Not anymore. You're not alone." Her eyes met his, and for a moment something passed between them. A quiet understanding. She didn't say anything, but Jackson knew that she had finally admitted something she had kept hidden for so long. They continued on in silence, the tension between them hanging in the air like a cloud. The crew reached the rebel camp just as night fell. The invaders were already there, setting up their weapons and preparing for an attack. Jackson's crew immediately engaged, their weapons flashing as they took down the enemy forces one by one. Arya moved with them, silent as ever, her eyes scanning the battlefield. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She was a machine, a skilled warrior who had been shaped by the horrors of her past. The battle was intense, but the crew fought with everything they had, pushing back the invaders step by step. At one point, Jackson found himself cornered by two invaders. He was about to make his move when Arya appeared out of nowhere, taking down both enemies with swift, precise strikes. She didn't say a word, just turned and walked away, disappearing into the chaos. The fight raged on for hours, but eventually, the crew triumphed. The invaders were defeated, and the rebel base was saved. The crew, battered and bruised, gathered around to catch their breath. The rebels cheered, thanking them for their help, but Jackson's mind was still on Arya. He found her standing alone at the edge of the camp, staring into the distance. Her expression was distant, her eyes lost in the past. Jackson walked up to her, not saying anything at first. He didn't need to. "You did good, Arya," he said quietly. "You saved us." Again, Arya didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her face unreadable. Then finally she spoke. "I don't know if I'll ever stop running," she said softly. "But maybe I don't have to anymore." Jackson stood beside her watching the stars. For the first time he understood. Arya wasn't just running from her past anymore, she was ready to face it, to confront it, and maybe, just maybe, she had found a place to call home. "We're not going anywhere, Arya," Jackson said, his voice steady. "You've got a family, now, and we've got your back." Arya glanced at him, her eyes a little softer than before. "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And for the first time, Jackson saw the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. The Seraphim cruised silently through the galaxy, its engines purring as the crew prepared for their next journey. The mission to the rebel base had been a success, but the victory was bittersweet. Arya had saved them once again, proving that she wasn't just a cook or a silent warrior. She was a protector, a survivor, and now she was beginning to find a place where she could truly belong. But even as the ship sailed through the stars, Arya's past was never far from her mind. She had spent years running from the memories of her destroyed home and the people she had lost. But now she was faced with something she hadn't expected. A choice. A choice that could change everything. The crew gathered in the mess hall, one evening, their faces tired but content after a long day. Arya was at the counter preparing a simple meal for everyone. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but there was a tension in her shoulders, something that hadn't been there before. Jackson noticed it immediately. "Something on your mind, Arya?" Jackson asked as he approached her. She didn't look up right away. Instead, she kept chopping vegetables, her eyes focused on the task. After a moment, she sighed and set the knife down, turning to face him. "There's something I need to tell you," Arya said quietly. Her voice was steady, but Jackson could sense the weight behind her words. Jackson raised an eyebrow, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" "I've been offered a chance," she began, her eyes meeting his. "A chance to lead. To take back what was lost." Jackson frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Arya paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "The rebel base. It wasn't just a place for hiding. It was a symbol. A place where the last of my people held out against the invaders. I've been asked to lead them, to take control, to rebuild what we lost." Jackson's heart sank. He had a feeling this was coming. Arya had always carried the weight of her past with her, and now it seemed like that past was demanding her attention. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the same struggle that had been present ever since she had joined the crew. "But you don't have to do this, Arya," Jackson said, his voice soft. "You found a home here with us. You're part of this crew. You don't need to go back to all of that." Arya shook her head, her expression unreadable. "I know. But it's not just about me anymore. I have a responsibility. The people who survived, the ones who still have hope, they need a leader. And I'm the only one who can do it." Jackson took a step closer, his face serious. "And what about us? What about this crew? You can't just walk away from everything we've built together. You've become one of us, Arya. You've saved us. More times than I can count." Arya looked away for a moment, her eyes distant. "I don't want to leave. but I don't know if I can live with myself knowing I didn't try. I have to do this. For them. For my people. Jackson's heart clenched. He had never imagined this moment would come. Arya had become more than just a crew member. She had become someone he trusted, someone he admired, and the thought of losing her to her past, to a fight that had claimed so much of her already, was hard to bear. But he also knew that he couldn't keep her here, against her will. He couldn't force her to stay, not when her heart was calling her back to something bigger than the Seraphim. If you go, Jackson said quietly, his voice heavy, you have to promise me one thing. You promise me you'll come back. No matter what happens, you'll always have a place here with us. Arya looked at him, her eyes softening. I can't promise that, Jackson. I don't know what the future holds. But I'll always remember what you and the crew have done for me. I'll never forget that. Jackson nodded, his throat tight. He had known this was coming, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. Arya had a destiny beyond the Seraphim. It was a destiny she couldn't ignore. The crew gathered in the mess hall later that evening, and Jackson stood before them. They had all noticed the change in Arya, the way she had been distant lately, but none of them knew what she had been struggling with. Now, it was time to tell them. Arya has made a decision. Jackson began, his voice steady. She's been offered a chance to lead, to take back what was lost. She's going back to her people, to the rebellion. The room was silent for a moment. The crew exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. Finally, one of the crew members spoke up. Do what you need to do, Arya, he said quietly. We'll always have your back, no matter what. Others nodded in agreement, their faces filled with respect and understanding. Arya's eyes shimmered, a hint of emotion breaking through her usual calm. She hadn't expected this response, but it meant more to her than she could say. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I won't forget this. I won't forget any of you. The crew stood together for a moment, a quiet sense of unity settling over them. They weren't just a group of people thrown together by circumstance. They were a family, and that bond, though it was about to be tested, would never break. The next day, Arya stood in the hangar bay, her bags packed and ready to go. The crew gathered around her, offering their goodbyes. Jackson stood by her side, his hand on her shoulder. Good luck, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Whatever happens, know that we're here for you. Arya smiled, a real smile this time, and nodded. I'll always remember this crew. You've all become a part of me. And with that, she turned and walked toward the shuttle that would take her back to the rebel base. The doors closed behind her, and the Seraphim watched her leave, knowing that this was a chapter in their journey that had come to an end. But even as Arya flew away, a part of her would always remain with the crew. And as long as they had each other, they knew that no matter where their paths led, they would always find their way back home.